Hey, this is Vic Dorfman, and welcome back to our series on how to not get burned and hire great developers and great help for your tech, for your business, for your WordPress site. And today's topic is something called discovery, or sometimes it's called analysis. We call it analysis. And what it basically is when you're about to work on any kind of project that is anything significant, meaning anything over, let's say, a couple of hours. In order to get the result that you want, you absolutely must do some kind of planning. It's common sense, right? I mean, obviously, if you're going to build a skyscraper, you need the blueprints. And if you're building a summer cottage, you still need blueprints. You might not need blueprints to build like a sandcastle, right? You might not need blueprints to build a shed if you're very, very competent at shed building. But if you don't have a plan and if you don't have the objective requirements of what constitutes the finished product, and moreover, if you don't have what are called acceptance criteria that allow you and your developer, or in our case, us and our customers, to objectively agree that say, yes, this requirement is done when XYZ criteria are met, right? It can't be a matter of opinion. It can't be a matter of subjective opinion. It has to be objective, right? Otherwise, you're going to have disagreements, and that causes problems, that causes stress. And managing expectations is very, very important for your sanity, but certainly it's also good for keeping budgets on track and that kind of thing. So what is a discovery process? What does it look like? Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that you're going to do some kind of very large project. It's going to take many dozens of hours, maybe hundreds of hours. And so therefore you need to have a very, very strong plan in place. Now, the first caveat of this conversation, which is going to sound contradictory, but it's actually not contradictory, is that you cannot actually plan everything. Well, what do you mean you can't plan everything, Vic? You just said you have to have requirements and acceptance criteria to objectively agree on what makes the requirement done so that you don't have disagreements. Yes, this is true. But there is nuance in this kind of thing. There's such a thing as over planning. There's such a thing as under planning. And for something very, very large, so in other words, there are what are called, I think they are called scale effects. So basically, let's say from 0 to 5 hours, there's a particular quality to a project, right? From 5 hours to 50 hours, there's a qualitatively different approach. From 50 hours plus, there's a different approach. Why? Because even though all we're talking about is a difference in hours, it sounds linear, but it's not. It actually takes on a new quality altogether. Now, this may be kind of woo-woo or a little bit hard to understand. This is something that I'm not going to get super into. It's a little bit technical, but let's operate on the assumption that it's to some degree true. Okay. What that means is if you're doing a very large project, you're going to scope out the requirements of what you want done, but you're probably not going to have what are called acceptance criteria. So let me give you an example. A requirement will be create a web page. Okay, well, a web page can be a million different things. It could be a small web page. It could be a large web page. It can be a green web page. It could be a blue web page. It could have buttons. It could not have buttons. It could have video, could not have video. It could have animations or not have animations, right? So if all we agree on is that you want a web page and we say, yes, okay, we'll do it. And then we deliver the web page, you might look at it and say, what the heck is this? This is not what I wanted. And we'd say, well, you wanted a web page, didn't you? Yeah, but I wanted this, this, and this, and this, and this. Well, we didn't actually talk about that, right? So that is where the requirements come in. So let's say you want a button. Okay, where do you want it? What color should it be? What should happen when you click on it? Those are the acceptance criteria. They are the things that have to be true in order for the requirement to be considered complete. And again, it's at the same time, it's very easy to overdo this, right? If you try, like, even if you're building something as simple as a web page, and it's not always simple, but let's say we're building a simple landing page and we go through an analysis process, which may or may not really be necessary, but let's say we're doing it. And then I come back to you and I say, okay, well, what color should the button be? And you say blue. And then I say, which blue? Give me the hex code. And what should the borders be, rounded, semi-rounded, or square? What should the exact coordinate positioning be of the, like, it would drive you crazy, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. That is way too detailed. That's way too in depth. And you would rightfully be annoyed because aren't you hiring a professional who should kind of understand these things? And a lot of what I found, a lot of the sort of like frustrations and disagreements that can occur in a collaboration are because of the, let's say, a disagreement on what, or let's say a misunderstanding, a mismatch of understanding on who is responsible for what and to what degree. That is also kind of stating the obvious. But coming back to the level of depth that is required, what you really want is you really want to keep it simple and you want to keep it flexible. So, for example, if we're going to work on a very large project, it's impossible to scope out everything in advance. We've tried, we have failed. It's not only impossible, it's not recommended. It's counterproductive because once you, as the customer, you start seeing things shape up, you're going to want the flexibility to pivot. You're going to want the opportunity to say, well, hey, you know what? This is really cool. Can we change this a little bit? In other words, you're going to start to get inspired and you're going to start having ideas. And it's like, well, if we've planned everything in advance and if we made a fixed price quote for the project, then anything you change is going to augment that scope and it's going to augment that price. And so in other words, if we're going strictly by the book, we'll say, no, we can't do it because if we make any changes, then it changes what it costs us. So it changes what we charge. And it just becomes this huge bureaucratic mess. What we have found, and we've been doing this for a long time, is that what you really want to do is work on an open-ended basis. Now, from your perspective, you might be saying, hey, Vic, that sounds great to you because you can just keep billing hours forever and ever. And that is obviously a factor, is that you don't want to not know when your budget is going. You don't want to not know what something is going to cost you. True. And that's where a level of trust and flexibility on a customer's part also comes into play, because knowing that you will want to pivot, 9 times out of 10, a customer will want in the middle of the project, midstream, will want to make various changes, will change their mind, will come into some new information or new understanding, or had a meeting with the board, or the CEO changed their mind, like any number of things, not least of which is your own desire to influence the project, may change, will change for sure, causing any kind of fixed scope or fixed price that you initially spent a bunch of time putting together to change just like that. And so, in other words, you hamstring yourself, you lose flexibility, and that ultimately hurts you. Now, where you have to be careful on the other end of that is you have to have a trust and an understanding with your developer or with your team, right? So it doesn't mean that you don't do a discovery process. You have to still understand, at least at a general level, and this is from the point of view of the developer or the agency that you're working with, you have to understand what you're trying to accomplish, right? Now, it's up to the team or the developer to figure out how to accomplish it. And if they're a competent team or a competent developer, they will do it in the best possible way that they know how, right? The code will be clean. It won't be a bunch of spaghetti code. It will follow best practices. It'll be secure. We'll use out-of-the-box technology, all of the things that you would expect somebody to do. But the mechanics, the little nuances, you don't necessarily even want to know about those, right? And actually, you get in your own way when you start worrying about those things too much. The focus should be on the result and on a sort of like a maintainability of the code and of the plugins, right? So you don't want to build something that only that developer can administer or work with, right? You don't want to build a black box. In other words, you want to build something that somebody else would be able to come in and look at and understand what's happening and continue to work with it. So what I'm advocating for basically is that if you're hiring developers for, let's say, a project of any size or an agency, if they don't have some kind of discovery process, and it should be paid, and I'll get into why I think it should be paid, but if they don't have some kind of discovery process, I'm not talking about a Zoom call. That's not a discovery process. That's a sales call. Even if you discuss the project requirements, whatever, that's literally, yes, we can do it, give us money. That's what that is. And then we'll figure everything out on the back end. And then what happens, maybe you've had this experience, because a lot of our customers have had this experience, is people agree to things too quickly. They get into it. They realize it's a lot more work than they thought. The developer realizes it's a lot more work than he or she thought. And then they come back to you asking for more money. And you're like, well, I thought it was going to be this much or this range. And they said, yeah, but it's more work. And now you're in a dilemma. Now you're in a bit of a hostage situation, right? Because on the one hand, if you dump this developer and go with somebody else, you're starting from scratch. There's a good possibility that This developer will keep the code. You burn the relationship. On the other hand, if you keep working with this person, you have no idea how much longer they're going to string you along and how much this thing is going to cost you at the end of the day. It's a real dilemma, right? So how do you prevent this situation from happening? Well, I would insist on some kind of paid discovery process, right? And discovery is basically a series of calls and emails and interactions that is designed to understand specifically the result you're after, what the requirements are that comprise that result, the blueprints, let's say, the acceptance criteria to the degree that it's sort of practical and advisable to list them, and a range of prices and a range of timelines to completion, right? And I say a range because you don't actually know. You can never know in advance how long something is going to take in development, right? There are maybe certain very specific, minute scenarios where if we've done the same thing over and over and over, we'll have a very exact idea of how much it costs if it's a very defined thing. But generally, you have a range, and that range is rooted in experience and sort of an understanding of the tech that the company has worked with, right? Like, for example, if you ask me to build a membership site, and again, that's like, how long is a piece of string? We have what's called a done for you membership site, which is like this combination of plugins with this setup and this many courses and blah, blah, blah. And so it's like productized to the point where we know approximately how long it takes us every time. And there's, a level of automation there as well. But this process is collaborative. That's another very important key distinction is you can't just like say, hey, I want this. And then the team or the developer just magically understands everything right away and magically builds this beautiful thing that's exactly what you always wanted. It doesn't work that way. There's a teamwork component. There's a collaboration that needs to happen where you guys discuss this in depth, clarify everything perfectly. And only once you've signed off on the scope document, does that person move forward or that team move forward. And the reason I say this should be paid, right? I made an asterisk there. Why should analysis or discovery be paid? It's to your advantage. It's in your interest that it's paid. Because what will happen is that developer or that agency will take that process seriously if they're paid for it. In fact, if they don't charge for it, they probably don't take it seriously. And what they are doing, either intentionally or unintentionally, is they are incentivizing you to move forward before you're really ready and before you both understand what you're trying to do and approximately what's involved in terms of cost and timelines. And it's also incentivizing the developer to basically do as many of these as possible and get as many people in the door as possible, right? Rather than saying, well, wait a minute, let's make sure that I understand what you want so that I know if I can even help you in the first place, right? Because there are scenarios, and we've had these come up, where a prospective customer comes to us, we begin the analysis process, and then we realize that we don't have the capabilities in our team, because we're a very specific type of team. We don't have the capabilities in our team to do a part of the project or maybe the entire project, right? So that's a scenario where we would transparently come to the prospective customer and say, hey, we can do 1, 2, and 3, but number 4, maybe it's a mobile app or something like that, which we don't do. But what we can do is we can work with our partner. We have a partner for certain services that we don't do ourselves, like design, like mobile development, with whom we've built a relationship over time that we either refer you to them for this component, or we'll take care of it on a white label basis and we'll simply embed it or bake it into the cost of the project, right? So this is also, in addition to preparing yourself for the project properly, it's also an opportunity to get to know your developer or your agency better and see how they communicate, get a better feel for them, like see their level, because anybody can put their best foot forward for one call and, sort of like, but once you have enough conversations, you start to see through people's bullshit. If they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, you start to see these little red flags, right? And that's very important because you're about to spend a lot of money, right? So the short story here is that it's very important that the team or developer you work with has some kind of discovery process. Number one, charges something for it. We charge $50 an hour for our discovery process, which is a third of what we charge for our development, which is $150 an hour, depending on the nature of the development. And the reason we do this is because even though it's something that is required in order for us to even engage us, we have to do it. But we want to reduce the risk to you by making it less expensive. Not only that, in some cases, and we're kind of playing with the idea of removing this component from our process, But let's say it used to be that we would make the analysis refundable. So in other words, if we spent 10 hours on a discovery process and that cost you $500, and then you decide not to move forward, we keep that money, right? Because we did work. Like, it's real work. It's brain work. You have to meet with the team. You have to research. You have to test things. It's actual real work. Just because it's not the project itself, it's the prep. It doesn't mean it's not work. It's actually the most important work, is understanding what we're going to do, what tech we're going to use, what are the roadblocks we need to discuss, what are the things we need to understand as a team, and in collaboration with you. So it's very, very important. And that's why it should be paid, among other reasons, right? But let's say it cost you $500, you chose not to move forward. Okay, we keep that money. But if you do move forward, we apply that $500 to your project, right? In other words, it's rebated against your project. And as of today, as of March 31st, 2025, we still do that. And again, the reason is because we're not trying to make money from discovery. We actually don't make money from discovery. If we do, it's negligible. We do it because you have to have skin in the game. You have to pay for this time. If you don't move forward, we should be paid for that time. If you do move forward, cool, we'll apply that as a rebate towards your project fees. And it's an important process. And to take it seriously, it has to have money involved, okay? Because if you don't, people are just going to breeze through it. They're going to do a half-assed job, And we've seen this. Actually, we had a kind of a fascinating and unique scenario that really explains this whole, really gives the justification for what I'm saying very succinctly. So we actually had a prospective customer who came to us and said, "Hey, Vic, we are considering MemberFix to build this platform, this e-learning platform. But we're also considering 3 other agencies." We said, "Okay, cool." I immediately was on my guard because we really don't want to be in a bake-off. It's not the right sort of dynamic for us, because what often happens, and actually what did wind up happening, is that we'll do our process, which they paid us for, right? So it was all transparent. It was all above board. They paid us for this process, but they did the same for these other agencies. And then they sort of started bouncing one off of the other. Like, "Hey, well, this guy said blah, 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 and you guys are saying this other thing. So explain to me." And now we're essentially not even competing. That I don't mind competing because I'm very confident in what we do. What I mind is the sort of lack of understanding, or let's say lack of maybe etiquette or awareness. And there's no reason why a customer should be aware of this, but it's still frustrating to us that, hey, different agencies are going to do things differently. It doesn't mean that one is right and the other is wrong. And of course, I understand the customer's point of view. They're just trying to get the best result. But essentially, it's a dynamic that we didn't want. Still, we went through with it because we wanted to help this customer. We wanted the business, and it was a fascinating project. And at the end of this process, we were selected as the agency to move forward with. And what was funny is that the customer was essentially giving us insight into the discovery process of these other agencies. I think one of them didn't charge anything, and they just completely half-assed it. They just put together some very rinky-dink scope doc that just didn't really encompass anything. I mean, it was basically just like, "Hey, here's this formality document. Hire us, give us money." And so they said, "No, no, thank you." Another agency did charge a smaller amount than we charged, and they wound up also producing a pretty poor scope document. And then another agency charged a bit more, but still less than us. We charged the most by a factor of 2 or 3. And they also didn't really have their shit together, pardon my language. But basically they chose us, right? They said, "But you guys were the most communicative. You spent the most time. You took this thing seriously. You have the most detailed scope doc. We discussed all of the tech that you're going to use, all of the potential pitfalls and contingencies we need to take into account, and yet it's flexible enough." And so it's something that is not negligible. It's not trivial. It's a nuanced thing. And I guess the irony here is the more that you do discovery, the better you get at it. So the better you get at your planning, at your blueprints, the better you're going to build the building, right? But that doesn't mean that if your blueprints were mistaken, that you can't modify them. You can and you should. And unfortunately, it didn't work out with that customer for other reasons, which is a very exceedingly rare situation in our company, that we have any kind of issues, or there was no rancor. It was perfectly amicable. It just didn't work out. They went in another direction. And so that is just to illustrate that without an analysis process, without a discovery process, you are sailing without a map, and you are going to pay a lot of money. Developers are going to hold you hostage, and you're going to not get what you want. You might get what you want, but you probably won't. And then you'll probably reach out to us and we're going to fix it because that happens all the time. It happens all the time. So if you want to engage a developer for anything over a couple of hours or anything beyond simple fixes, and simple is a sliding scale, or it's also a matter of subjective question. What is simple? What is not simple? I should add too, because since I just touched on this, part of the etiquette of this whole thing, and part of the reason we do this as well, is because sometimes customers have a mistaken idea, and it's not malicious, it's not intentionally manipulative or anything like that. It's just that sometimes, oftentimes, especially when a customer has dabbled with the tech enough themselves, it gives them some idea, rightly or wrongly, that this should take X amount of time, or this should cost Y amount of money. And when a customer approaches a developer, when you approach a developer or agency and you say, hey, I think this should take 10 hours and it should cost, $500. Just know, you can say that. You can say whatever you want. It's a free world, but just know that that resource is going to immediately raise a red flag, because it is ultimately the job of the person that you engage, or the team that you engage, to collaborate with you using a solid process to understand what you want, to conduct a discovery, to produce a scope document that outlines what you're trying to do, how we know when it's complete, those are their acceptance requirements, and a range of what it will cost and how long it will take. And I say a range because we don't know the exact amount of time. Nobody knows the exact amount of time. And if somebody puts an exact amount of time, they're pulling it out of their ass, because it's impossible. I mean, what they could do is they'll just, here's what a developer or agency will do. They'll say, okay, it's going to take 100 hours. And what that really means is, we think it's going to take like a maximum of 50 hours. So let's just charge 100, because that way, if it takes the maximum, we're still going to make money. And for you, that may be perfectly acceptable, because you may say, okay, it costs this much money. I'm willing to pay this much for this result, which is fine. But what you don't know, what nobody knows, is what may come up in the meantime. And so if some kind of technical issue or some kind of pivot occurs in the middle of the project that makes that project more expensive for the developer or the agency, now they're going to have to backtrack, or they're going to have to complete the project as agreed for the price agreed, and possibly not make any money, or possibly even take a loss. So that's why we never do fixed price projects anymore. We always work on an hourly basis, because it maintains an accountability for us, and it maintains an accountability for the customer. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's just what we have found to get the best results and create the least amount of frustration. So make sure you do analysis. Make sure you pay for analysis. Make sure you're super, super clear on what you're doing. Get some ranges. Don't rush through this process. It is the blueprint of whatever you're trying to build. You may not need to do it for anything small, let's say under 10 hours, but it's still good to do. I mean, look, if you're going to spend, let's say $100 an hour at 10 hours, it goes my light, and it's going to cost you $1,000. Wouldn't you rather pay an extra $100 to plan it, to make sure it goes really well, to make sure you're completely on the same page? Because then it'll go faster for the developer. And even if they charge you the same amount of money, you'll probably get a better result. Like, don't neglect or consider trivial the planning process. It is the most important part of the development process. The implementation process is still can be very complex, but if you don't have any plans, then you're going to screw yourself. If you plan too meticulously, you're also going to screw yourself. So look, it's not black and white, it's gray. There's a lot of nuance. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.